Hi, everyone. In this video, we're going through Chapter 15 content, and we're looking at athematic second aorists. Now, we had already called second aorists so-called thematic aorists. These are ones with the omicron or epsilon alternating in the regular pattern and using the same personal endings as we know from the other secondary tense that we know for past time, the imperfect. So this was on, s, e, or n, and then omen, ete, on. That worked great, but we had a vowel that was the thematic vowel that came into play. Now we're looking at a certain, and this is, I should say from the get-go, a very small class, but important class of verbs. As often their regularity matches their frequency and importance within the language. This is a class of verbs that has a vowel sound that is not thematic. So we're already used to seeing non-thematic situations when we look at, say, the aorist, where we have a characteristic alpha together with the sigma to make the first sigmatic aorist. Now we're looking at secondary endings that we are already familiar with, but with a kind of tricky way of handling a vowel that is not the thematic vowel, nor is it a tense vowel as we have with alpha in the sigmatic aorist, but is dependent upon the verb itself. So there's not one size fits all here. Each of these athematic second aorists has its own kind of peculiarities. So this really makes them irregular verbs, but the very nice thing here is that the endings are what we already know from secondary endings. So if you've already memorized your endings, nu, sigma, nu movable, men, te, and san, you're great for this. You know what to do. So the san is a little bit peculiar, but we'll come back to that. All right, so here we are. Bino, basomai, ebane. I walk, I step, I go. In the indicative here, again, these are past tenses. These are aorists, and therefore in the indicative, they're going to have that initial augment. And this is a initial consonant for the stem, bino, or ebane, bane. So the bay is really the aorist stem here. The nu is the, I guess you could call it a suffix, but it's really the terminal person and number element of the verb. The initial epsilon that we can see right here, that is, of course, the augment. So these have the augment, but then we just have bay all the way down. And then we'll have nu, sigma, no nu movable here, in part because the eta phonologically is just strong enough to stand on its own. It's not epsilon, which needs that extra support when it's before a word that begins with a vowel of the nu. So we lose the nu movable here. You'll only see ebe, and then ebemen, ebete, ebesan. All right, so again, familiar, but here instead of just ebane, where we would have absolute identity between the first person singular and the third person plural, they add the kind of more distinguishing mark of a third person plural. This is actually borrowed from the athematic first aorist, san. Imperatives, as always, the for the secondary singular, like ethi, and then beta. So y'all walk, hey, you singular walk. Infinitive, we're just going to put the standard, again, sigmatic aorist ending I, and then we add a little nasal infix here, nigh. So that's how we end up getting bay nigh. And note that for the purposes of accentuation, as always, this alpha iota diphthong is short, giving us a circumflex on the bay. And then our participle, it's going to take the form here of a long alpha, same as your standard sigmatic aorist endings, bas, basa, ban. But this is actually the result of contraction of a shortened form of this eta and the alpha, but it just looks standard. So there are phonological reasons that we can reconstruct these things, but as everything with Greek, it's going to probably vary in pronunciation from time to time, from writing system to writing system. The easiest thing to do is just memorize these charts. But I'm giving you here in this video an explanation of what's going on. Past indicative augment makes sense. Secondary endings make sense. But now in a couple situations where this is otherwise athematic, but with our imperfect endings, here in a couple spots, it's borrowing effectively from the sigmatic aorist. That's pretty easy to spot when we're looking at bino with this alpha stem, because again, that's much like our sigmatic aorist, things get a little bit more interesting when we go over here to an O stem in gignosko gnosomai, and now we're looking at egnon. So once again, this initial epsilon is simply a past indicative augment. So we can kind of mark that off. But now we've got an O sound that gets lengthened into omega all the way up and down. But again, we have the exact same endings, new sigma blank, because once again, the O is robust enough not to need a new movable, mentes san, nothi, probably the most famous second person singular imperative in all Greek from the inscription written at Delphi, knothi salton, know thyself, nota here. But now infinitive exactly as benai, but here we have not an alpha, but a kind of a different, and here we're using the diphthong omicron upsilon to express this lengthened form, an alternate form of this stem vowel. So we have O's over here, we have A's over here. Those are both robust and long. But here we have long alphas, and here we have omicron upsilon diphthongs. As we've gotten used to, these are O sounds just written in a different way. It's hard within the evolution of the language. We're picking an arbitrary point when we're looking at classical Attic Greek, and we're actually looking at the Ionic spelling of classical Attic Greek to get all these forms. These might look different if you're looking at different inscriptions, but this is the standard, and that's why we're learning it. And then we have a short form in the genitive, as we do here, simply bantos. That's, if this were long alpha, it would have a circumflex. Here, this is obviously a short omicron, gnontos, etc. All right, so that's the essential here. And now we have another verb that we're going to find later because it's athematic even in the present tense. So we haven't encountered any of those yet. So that's in book 2. But this is histemi, the verb to stand. So estain, smooth breathing in the aorist is I stood, I stopped. So estain, estes, este. Again, just eta stems, mente san. This looks so far exactly like bino, but note that this is actually slightly different. I don't know. It looks pretty much identical to the bino, actually, as we're seeing it here. Declined is the same as the sigmatic first aorist. All right, all of that. This is the one to look at as we're looking through these things. Something to know about bino and also histemi here. And to a certain extent, gignosko, these verbs often combine with prefixes. So that's what we have here. This is simply bino in the aorist, and this I went up, but with a prefix ana. We lose the second alpha of ana. It kind of gets elided away. The past indicative augment asserts itself. This tells us it's aorist. And then now we know, okay, this is I went up. If we want to make it they went up, it'd be ana besan, or ane besan. Y'all went up ane bete, ana bethi. This is imperative, so we don't have the imperfect or passive indicative augment. Anabethi, anabine, to go up one time, as opposed to continuously going up, which would be anabinane, present tense infinitive. Anabas, we have these things. So let's go through the exercise. I'll read it out loud, and then we'll just focus on these athematic aorist forms. So ar u buleste gnonai tie pen ho angelos. So untranslatable particle, marking this as a question. We'll have fronting of the negative here too. Is it not? Or do you all not want gnonai? So let's look at this. This I ending should give us pause, and we should say, yeah, that is the aorist infinitive ending. In the sigmatic aorist, we're used to getting a sigma here, gnosai, but this is not the sigmatic aorist. This is a athematic stem vowel aorist, and we drop in a nasal infix here, so nai, gnonai. So don't you all want to know what apen? Here we have another strong aorist, but this is a thematic one. What said? This is third person singular, from apon, apes, apen, hoangelos, and that's our third person nominative subject of apen. That means this T, which was a interrogative pronoun, what. We didn't know if that was the subject or the direct object. Now we have clarity because we have a nominative subject in the masculine. This T must be the direct object. So don't you all want to know what the messenger said? Hoi Athenaioi, conontes hoti hoi barbaroi haste thermapulas helon kaite atike proskorusin mala epobunto. All right, so the Athenians, conontes, let's take a pause here. When we see this new tau followed by a third declension ending, our sensors, our spidey sense should be going off that this is a participle. So that's a fine participial ending. We're familiar with these. You'd be forgiven for thinking that that is just a regular thematic vowel because we know the participles drop in a thematic vowel here. In this case, it's actually not thematic. It's actually the stem vowel of gno, or egnon is our third principal part, but it's a G-N-O sound. And here it's a short omicron for the participial forms. So the nice thing is you could totally forget that this was an athematic aorist and just treat it on, on analogy of a strong, that is second thematic aorist, or even a present tense verb, and you could recognize it as a participle. But this is a special situation. So this is aorist, third person, plural. It's not a verb, right? But that's what we're looking at. It's going to be working with hoi barbaroi. This is nominative, plural, masculine. So, sorry, I said barbaroi. That's actually after the haughty, the subordinating conjunction. So this is all going back to the Athenians. The Athenians, knowing that the barbarians had to take one time, that's halon from hyreo, Thermopylae, and proskorusin, Attike. So that's approaching Attica. And then, so what are we saying? This halon could be a few things, could be first person singular, but in fact it is third person plural with this hoi barbaroi subject. Knowing that the barbarians took one time Thermopylae and Proskorusi are approaching Attica, were very afraid. All right, one thing just to flag here quickly. Well, the real thing to focus on is gnontes. That's our new form. Proskorusi here is presented in the present tense, which is a little bit strange because we have here in epobunto a entirely imperfect verb. So in these haughty clauses, we have what's known as relative time expression. The Athenians were very afraid in the past, knowing, and participles always have relative time, that the barbarians already had taken Thermopylae and were then approaching Proskorusi. So in English, we would prefer to take this aorist, this pastime marker, as a pluperfect, an English pluperfect, placing it in temporal sequence before the main verb. And then we would also slide this present tense verb back to kind of agree with the time of this anchoring main verb. Greek doesn't care about that. With a haughty clause, you're able to just use the tenses that would be relative to, if you were an Athenian at that time, you would be thinking, oh, the barbarians have taken and they are approaching Attica. That would be what you think. But in English, you can't just say that. You have to shift all the time back. Greek is wonderful in not requiring you to go through that extra step. That's great for Greeks. It's bad when you have to move it over to English because then you have to think and make the transition. But we're already practiced at doing this. It's a difference of kind of embedded speech within the languages. All right, that's maybe interesting to me, but we'll stay focused for the rest of this as we go through 3 through 10. Themistocles strategos on anesti, kai tous Athenaeus epesen me eken tuis polemiois. So Themistocles, and you can read about him, being a general, anaste, stood up. So this is one time, and this is from histemi, but again, we don't know that verb yet. All we know at the top of this page, or maybe it was the last, where are we? There we are, here we are. I stood, I stopped, but this is third person singular, and this is stood up with ana. So stood up and persuaded. This is from patho, pesomai, and then here we have epeson, but here third person singular aorist. So he persuaded the Athenians not to Achain, this is new vocabulary, kind of give way, cede to, and it takes a dative, give in, maybe we should say, to the enemy. Again, technically plural, but in translation, we tend to treat polemioi as singular. All right, the enemy. Hoi Athenaio tastic gunaikas kai tus paidas estin salamina ko misantes estas naus es ebesan. All right, here's our athematic aorist. Again, we have a prefix, we've got a past indicative augment, we have the stem vowel, which is here lengthened eta sound, and then we have the third person plural, again, similar on analogy to what is there in the sigmatic aorist. So this means they went or they walked, and they did it in the past, but they walked toward something. They walked toward the ships. And in this sense, they're not just walking toward them, they're walking on them, they're embarking. So the Athenians, comisantes, guiding, accompanying, sending the women and the children to Salamis, embarked upon the ships. Hoxerxes, knus. All right, so this is our the athematic verb here from gignosko. Note that there's no reduplication. That's how you're going to know that this is not present tense. It's not nosoma, it's not future. So this is coming from our third principal part, egnon. We've dropped the omega nu ending, but we still need an omicron sound, an O sound. And this is the lengthened form for the participle. Again, remember that participles, for the nominative at least, this is going to be originally omicron nu tau sigma. The sigma kind of eats the nu tau, but then we have what's known as compensatory lengthening. That omicron lengthens into this omicron upsilon diphthong. So that's how we end up with nous. This is nominative masculine singular participle working with Xerxes. How do we translate it? Xerxes, having known that having known that in mind they had, that is the Greeks, had in mind to flee. So Xerxes, knowing at that time in the past, momentarily, that the Greeks had in mind to flee, he wanted a bouleta from boulamai, boulezamai, and then anankasai, wanted to force, to compel. This is the aorist infinitive of anakazo, to compel, to force, to demand. Autus stenai. Again, now we have another athematic aorist here. We have our stereotypical sigmatic, or kind of not our second aorist ending, which is ain, but these other aorist endings for psi, or in this case nai, stay nai, to stand up one time. Tikai pros te salamina makestai. So he had in mind to force them. So this autus is going to be this the head of these infinitives, basically acting as their subject. So them to stand up and to fight in front of Salamis, in the Bay of Salamis. I should say stand up. That's maybe ana histemi or aneste. This one is going to be kind of stand up as like, hey, this is a stick up. You're stopped. You were moving and then you stand. So it's not that they rise on their boats from their oarlocks and just look out. It's that they're kind of stopped up there. Ekbethi ektes neos opai kai stethi ento chomati. So these are imperative forms. This initial epsilon is not a past indicative augment. It's part of the prefix ek. So disembark, get off, bino, away from, out of the ship. And remember, this is a peculiar genitive form of this digamma based third declension noun, nous, but that's what we've got going on here. It's all sorts of complicated phonology there with quantitative metathesis and other things. Don't worry about that. Just know that, oh yeah, that's the ship word, and taste tells us it's genitive. So get it, disembark from the ship, oh child, or in a Greek context, this could be addressed to an enslaved person, kai stethi, and stand on the pier. Nice new vocabulary there. I think this is good. I think you could do the next 4 on your own. I'll leave them for your personal benefit and learning. But I hope this was helpful as you continue on in your lessons. This is tricky stuff, right? So just to recap, what we're looking at is a new class of aorist verbs. These are infrequent, or they're not many, but they are somewhat frequent. Verbs of going, knowing, and standing are core vocabulary. So that's why they can kind of support this slight irregularity. All of our old standby rules are going to apply. When it's indicative, has the past indicative augment, has secondary endings because we're in an aorist tense. Infinitives have this kind of aorist style infinitive ending because indeed they are aorist I, but now instead of having a sigmatic aorist, we get a new put in here before the nigh endings. That's going to be common for a number of infinitives that we'll see. And then instead of either a sigma and alpha or an epsilon or omicron, we have these stem vowels that are part of the actual stem of the verb. They are a little bit flexible. Eta is going to be the characteristic one of Bido, but you can also have an alpha when you need, and that shows up especially in the participial forms. Same with gignosco. We're going to have omegas in the indicative and imperative and the infinitive, but these are going to turn into omicrons in the participle, and it's because of the new tau sigma original ending that we end up getting gnus here, and we have lengthening here before the feminine sigmatic first declension ending, but we simply have gnon here because all that we've lost from the stem is a tau that's a dental stop that didn't necessarily lengthen this omicron, and we see that short omicron persist in all of the so-called oblique cases, everything that's not nominative down the rest of the third declension masculine and neuter forms. All right, that was a lot of vocabulary, but I hope step by step it's making a bit of sense. We'll see you in the next video.